We needed someone who fits our culture, Trevor said, leaning back in his leather chair with a satisfied smile. I'm sure you understand. I stared at him across the desk, the quarterly operations report I'd prepared still clutched in my hands. You're replacing me with Greg Wilson? He has no experience in manufacturing, no management background at all. Greg brings fresh perspectives, Trevor replied, straightening his designer tie. Northwest Timber Products is evolving. We need leadership that aligns with our new direction. I've managed operations here for 12 years, I said, fighting to keep my voice steady. Our efficiency metrics are at an all-time high. Client retention is 94%. What exactly needs changing? Trevor's smile tightened. Clara, this isn't about your performance. You're excellent at what you do. But Greg and I share a vision for the company's future that's more dynamic. My name is Clara Novak, 42 years old, operations manager at Northwest Timber Products in Spokane, Washington. Or at least I was until this moment. I've dedicated my professional life to this company, streamlining our lumber processing operations, implementing sustainable forestry practices, and building relationships with clients across the Pacific Northwest. When do you want me to leave? I asked, my mind already calculating severance, health insurance continuation, and job prospects. We'll need a 2-week transition. Greg starts today. He'll shadow you until you finish up on the 15th. Trevor stood, indicating our meeting was over. I've asked HR to prepare a generous severance package. Your years of service have been valued. I nodded and rose to leave, dignity intact despite the churning in my stomach. As I turned toward the door, Trevor added, "Oh, and Clara? Let's keep this positive with the team. I've announced that you're pursuing new opportunities." Of course, he'd announced my departure before even telling me. Back at my desk, I found an email from Diane in HR with severance details and a confidentiality agreement. As I scanned the document, a message popped up from my assistant, Thomas. What's going on? Trevor just introduced some guy named Greg as our new operations manager. Said you're leaving? Before I could respond, I noticed Greg himself approaching, tall, tanned, and wearing a golf polo under his hastily donned blazer. He extended his hand with an easy smile. Clara, great to finally meet you. Trevor's told me so much about you. Behind him, I could see Trevor watching from the conference room, champagne flute in hand. He raised it slightly in my direction before turning to laugh at something said by the VP of sales. I'm sure he has, I replied, shaking Greg's hand firmly. Let me show you around. As we walked through the production floor, I realized with growing unease that Greg didn't know the difference between pine and cedar, couldn't read our processing charts, and referred to our largest client by the wrong name. This wasn't just a replacement. It was a dismantling of everything I'd built. I joined Northwest Timber Products fresh out of my MBA program, initially as a process analyst. The company was struggling then. Inefficient operations, high waste percentages, and a reputation for missed delivery dates. I worked my way up through various positions, eventually becoming operations manager under the previous CEO, Harold Bergman. Harold recognized my talents for organization and problem solving. He mentored me, challenged me, and ultimately trusted me to revamp our entire production system. Together, we transformed Northwest from a struggling mid-sized lumber supplier into one of the most respected sustainable timber operations in the region. When Harold announced his retirement last year, the board conducted an external search for his replacement. They settled on Trevor Rhodes, who came from a larger competitor with promises to modernize and disrupt the traditional timber industry. I had reservations about his flashy style, but was determined to work collaboratively for the company's benefit. At first, Trevor seemed interested in understanding our operations. He scheduled lengthy meetings with each department head, asked thoughtful questions, and praised our efficiency metrics during his first board presentation. I began to think my concerns had been unfounded. Then small changes began. Trevor started bringing in consultants who knew nothing about timber, but spoke confidently about corporate culture and brand identity. He renovated the executive floor while postponing critical equipment upgrades I'd been requesting for months. He instituted mandatory team-building activities that pulled workers off the production floor during our busiest periods. Still, I adapted. I adjusted schedules to accommodate his new initiatives while maintaining productivity. I translated his buzzword-filled directives into actionable steps for my team. I defended these changes to skeptical employees who trusted my judgment. What I didn't know was that Trevor had been undermining me behind the scenes. I learned later that he'd been telling board members I was resistant to change and stuck in old methodologies. He'd started playing golf with several key board members and with Greg Wilson, a former college classmate with no experience in our industry. I maintained my professionalism, focusing on what I could control: operations, efficiency, client relationships. When our quarterly numbers showed record productivity despite the disruptions, I thought my position was secure. Results would speak for themselves. The week before my termination, I noticed Trevor and Greg having lunch in Trevor's office. They seemed to be reviewing documents, my operations reports, I assumed, as part of Trevor's ongoing department evaluations. I even prepared additional materials for them, wanting to ensure they understood our production processes fully. Harold called me that same week. He'd heard rumors about leadership changes from his old industry contacts. "Watch your back, Clara," he warned. "Trevor's been asking strange questions about the extent of your authority." I thanked him for the concern, but dismissed it as retired CEO paranoia. Harold was protective of the company, and of me. Surely Trevor wouldn't replace his most effective manager without cause. I was wrong. My first day of the transition was excruciating. Greg followed me everywhere, making notes on a leather-bound pad but asking no substantive questions. At our morning operations meeting, Trevor introduced Greg as the new visionary leader who'll take our processes to the next level. My team looked between us in confusion, their expressions ranging from shock to anger on my behalf. "I'll be available these next 2 weeks to ensure a smooth handover," I said, maintaining my composure. "Let's make sure our production targets don't slip during this transition." After the meeting, several team members stopped by my office privately to express their disbelief. Tomas, my assistant for 7 years, was particularly upset. "This is ridiculous," he fumed. "Greg asked me if lumber comes from pine trees or pine bushes. He literally doesn't know what wood is." "He'll learn," I said automatically, though I didn't believe it. By mid-afternoon, I was reviewing our inventory management system with Greg, explaining the custom software I'd helped develop to track materials from forest to finished product. "This seems unnecessarily complicated," Greg commented, suppressing a yawn. "At my last company, we used a simple Excel spreadsheet for everything." "What company was that?" I asked, genuinely curious since Trevor had been vague about Greg's background. "Oh, I managed my family's car wash business for a while," he replied casually. "Different industry, but business is business, right?" I stared at him, momentarily speechless. A car wash. He was replacing me with someone whose experience was running a car wash. That evening, as I was preparing to leave, I overheard Trevor and Greg laughing in the executive lounge. The door was partially open, and their voices carried clearly. "She's still explaining systems like I'm actually going to use them," Greg chuckled. "Wait till she finds out we're outsourcing half the operations management to that consulting firm." Trevor's response made my blood run cold. "The board doesn't know that part yet. Let's get Clara out the door first, then present the consultancy as a cost-saving measure. Between your salary and the consultants, we're still spending more, but the board only sees the headcount reduction." "And you're sure about my compensation package?" That signing bonus seemed almost too good to be true. Worth every penny to have someone who'll actually support my vision instead of questioning everything with her efficiency metrics and sustainable practices. I stepped away silently, my mind racing. This wasn't just about replacing me with a golf buddy. They were dismantling my entire department, potentially jeopardizing the operations I'd spent years perfecting. And they were misleading the board about the financial implications. Back in my office, I sat heavily in my chair, staring at the operations manual I'd been updating for Greg. 12 years of dedication reduced to a 2-week transition that was clearly just for show. My team would likely be next on the chopping block once the consultants identified redundancies. I felt a complex mix of emotions: anger, betrayal, concern for my team, worry for the company itself. Northwest wasn't just my employer, it had been my professional home. As I packed my bag to leave, I noticed the board meeting agenda for next month sitting in my inbox, sent to me by mistake, since I would no longer be employed when it occurred. I read it slowly, an idea beginning to form. Perhaps this transition wouldn't go exactly as Trevor planned. The next morning, I arrived early to find Diane from HR waiting by my office. "Clara, I need the signed severance agreement today," she said apologetically. "Trevor's asking for it." I had deliberately not signed the document yet, using the time to review my options. "I'm still consulting with my attorney," I explained. "The non-compete clause seems unusually restrictive." Diane lowered her voice. "Between us, I agree, but Trevor insists it's non-negotiable." "I understand. I'll have my decision by tomorrow." As Diane left, my desk phone rang. It was Elaine Robinson, a board member who had worked closely with Harold before his retirement. "Clara, are you free for lunch today?" she asked without preamble. "I've just heard some disturbing news." Hope flickered briefly. Perhaps the board would intervene. "I can make time," I replied. We met at a small cafe well away from the office. Elaine, in her 60s with a no-nonsense demeanor that had made her successful in the timber industry, got straight to the point. "Trevor told the executive committee you requested to leave," she said, stirring her coffee. "Said you were burned out and recommended Greg as your replacement. Several of us were surprised, but he presented it as a done deal." "That's not what happened," I said, careful to state facts without emotional coloring. "He terminated my position and had already hired Greg before informing me." Elaine's expression hardened. "I suspected as much. Trevor's been making unilateral decisions despite board governance requirements. Unfortunately, he's convinced the board chair, James, that he needs operational freedom to modernize the company." "So there's nothing to be done?" "Not officially, not yet. James won't call a special meeting just for a personnel change, even at your level. Our next full board meeting isn't for 2 weeks. My shoulders slumped slightly. 2 weeks was after my last day. "However," Elaine continued, "I'd like to invite you to that meeting as my guest. It's unusual, but not unprecedented. You've presented to the board before, and I can request your attendance for questions on operations during the transition." "Trevor won't like that." "Trevor doesn't need to know until the day of the meeting," she replied with a hint of steel in her voice. "In the meantime, document everything, especially any plans that contradict what the board has approved." I left lunch feeling cautiously optimistic. If I could present the facts directly to the board, perhaps Trevor's plans would be scrutinized more carefully. That afternoon, I met with Trevor to discuss the transition timeline. I decided to test the waters. "I've been thinking about the severance agreement," I began. "I'm concerned about the non-compete restrictions." Trevor's smile didn't reach his eyes. "They're standard for executives. You know too much about our operations to allow you to work for competitors." "Then perhaps we should discuss an adjustment to the compensation, given the restrictions' impact on my employment prospects." His expression hardened. "The package is generous as is. If you're unhappy with it, we could revisit whether a severance is offered at all." The threat was clear. I nodded and retreated, deciding to sign the agreement while I considered my options. Later that day, I overheard Greg on a call in the conference room, door ajar. "The transition's going fine. She suspects nothing. Yes, the outsourcing proposal is ready. No, the board won't see the full cost implications until it's implemented." When he emerged, I was reviewing production reports at a nearby desk. He startled slightly upon seeing me. "How much did you hear?" he demanded, his friendly facade dropping momentarily. "Hear what?" I replied innocently. "I was just updating these reports for you." Greg seemed appeased but remained wary. That evening, I discovered my email access had been restricted in preparation for your departure, 2 weeks early. When I called IT, they confirmed the directive had come from Trevor directly. The message was clear. They didn't trust me with information, even during the transition period. Whatever Trevor and Greg were planning, they didn't want me to see it. I needed to find out what it was, and quickly. With my email access restricted, I had to get creative. I still had physical access to the building and my regular systems. They needed me to train Greg, after all. During our morning review of client accounts, I suggested we look at the upcoming contract renewals. We have Wilson Construction's renewal next month, I explained, pulling up the file. They've been with us for 8 years and account for 12% of our revenue. Greg shifted uncomfortably. Trevor mentioned Wilson. I think he's handling that personally. That's unusual. The operations team typically manages our major account renewals since we coordinate the production schedules, I said, watching his reaction carefully. New processes, Greg replied vaguely. Part of our modernization. Later, I casually asked Janice from accounting about the Wilson contract while we waited for coffee in the break room. Oh, didn't you hear? She whispered. Trevor's brother-in-law just became their new purchasing director. Trevor took him golfing last weekend. The pieces started coming together. I spent my lunch break in the company archives, reviewing board minutes from Trevor's hiring. His mandate had been clear. Maintain Northwest's industry-leading sustainable practices while improving profitability. Nothing about outsourcing operations or restructuring client relationships. That afternoon, I received a text from Harold. Heard Wilson Construction is getting a sweetheart deal from NW. Price point 15% below market. This true? If Trevor was slashing prices for his brother-in-law's company while cutting experienced staff, he wasn't just restructuring, he was potentially compromising the company's financial stability for personal connections. I needed proof, but with my email restricted, I couldn't access the new contract drafts. Then I remembered. Thomas still had full system access. I need to train Greg on the contract management system, I told Thomas. Can you pull up the latest Wilson draft for us? Thomas did so without question, and I quickly scanned the document while ostensibly showing Greg the system's features. The pricing was indeed significantly below our standard rates, with unusually generous payment terms. Most concerning was a clause granting Wilson Construction preferred allocation during supply shortages, something we'd never offered any client. Is this the final version? I asked Greg casually. Trevor's reviewing it one more time, he replied. He's really focused on securing this renewal. I nodded, memorizing the key details before closing the file. Just wanted to show you where to find these in the system. That evening, I called Elaine. Trevor's giving preferential terms to his brother-in-law's company, I explained. Below market pricing and supply guarantees that could impact our other clients. Can you prove it? Elaine asked. I've seen the contract draft, but I don't have a copy. We need documentation, Clara. The board won't act on hearsay. I hesitated, then made a decision. I think there's more happening. The outsourcing plan Greg mentioned might connect to this. If Trevor's redirecting resources to favored clients while cutting internal expertise, it could compromise our operations and sustainability commitments, Elaine finished. The board would definitely need to review such fundamental changes. The next morning, Trevor called me into his office. His expression was cold. It's come to my attention that you've been accessing files outside your transition duties, he said without preamble. Given your reluctance to embrace these changes, we think it's best to end your employment immediately rather than continuing the 2-week transition. I felt surprisingly calm. On what grounds? We don't need grounds with at-will employment, as you know, but if you prefer, I can cite breach of confidentiality or failure to support company directives. I see. And the severance package? Still available, provided you sign today, with the addition of a non-disparagement clause. He slid a revised agreement across the desk. Otherwise, we'll terminate for cause, and you'll receive nothing. It was a calculated move designed to silence me before the board meeting. Trevor was clearly worried about what I might have discovered. I had a decision to make: sign and take the money, or reject the agreement and lose my severance, but maintain my ability to speak freely to the board. What Trevor didn't know was that I had already made my choice. "I'll need time to review the new agreement," I said, taking the document without committing. "Today, Clara. I need your decision and signature today," Trevor insisted. I nodded noncommittally and returned to my office to find Greg already there, examining my files. "Just getting familiar with everything," he said without a hint of embarrassment. "Since it seems your departure might be accelerated." "Take whatever you need," I replied, beginning to pack my personal items. "Though you might want to actually read our sustainable forestry protocols before your meeting with the environmental compliance team this afternoon." Greg looked blank. "What meeting?" "It's on the operations calendar. Quarterly review of our sustainability metrics. The team will expect you to explain any variances in our replanting schedules or carbon offset calculations." Panic flashed across his face, and he quickly left, presumably to find Trevor. I took advantage of his absence to call Thomas into my office. "I need your help," I said quietly. "But it could put you in an awkward position." Thomas didn't hesitate. "What do you need?" "Access to the shared drive for 1 hour, and copies of the consultant proposal Trevor's been developing." "The outsourcing plan?" "I can do better than that. I've been backing up all unusual document requests since you told me you were leaving." Thomas pulled a flash drive from his pocket. "Trevor had me print the proposal yesterday but didn't know I saved a copy. It's all here: the outsourcing details, the new pricing structures, everything." I stared at him in surprise. He shrugged. "You trained me to maintain records of all operational changes. This seemed important." I quickly reviewed the files. The outsourcing proposal was worse than I'd imagined. It would replace our experienced operations team with overseas consultants who had no background in timber or sustainability practices. The projected savings only appeared positive because they excluded transition costs and potential compliance issues. Most alarmingly, the proposal indicated implementation would begin immediately after my departure, without waiting for board approval. I also found the complete Wilson construction contract with Trevor's brother-in-law's name clearly indicated, plus similar preferential deals for 2 other companies connected to Trevor's personal network. "Thomas, if Trevor asks, you never gave me this." "Gave you what?" he replied with a wink. "I'm just helping you pack." By afternoon, I'd copied the essential documents and returned the flash drive to Thomas. I then called Elaine. "I have what we need," I told her. "But Trevor's trying to force me out immediately with a non-disparagement clause." "Don't sign anything," she advised. "I'll talk to James. This is exactly the kind of unilateral action the board needs to know about." An hour later, Trevor stormed into my office, face flushed with anger. "What did you say to Elaine Robinson?" "That you were asking me to sign a revised severance agreement," I replied calmly. "She just called James demanding a special executive committee meeting tomorrow about your termination." I kept my expression neutral. "That's her prerogative as a board member." Trevor leaned across my desk. "Sign the agreement now, Clara. Walk away with your severance and your reputation intact. Push this further, and I'll make sure everyone in the industry knows you were terminated for cause." It was a serious threat in our specialized field. I could sign and secure my financial cushion, or risk my professional reputation by fighting. "I'll have my answer for you tomorrow morning," I said, buying time. Trevor left unsatisfied, and I spent the evening preparing a detailed presentation of everything I'd discovered: the outsourcing plan, the preferential contracts, the misrepresentations to the board. I organized the documents chronologically, highlighting where Trevor's actions contradicted his board-approved mandate. By morning, I was ready. But when I arrived at the office, security stopped me at the entrance. "I'm sorry, Ms. Novak. Your access has been revoked." Trevor had made his move. Now I needed to make mine. "Ms. Novak?" I turned to find James Werner, the board chair, approaching the security desk. "Elaine mentioned you might have trouble accessing the building." He nodded to the guard. She's with me for the executive committee meeting. The guard looked uncertain but couldn't refuse the board chair. James escorted me to the executive floor, explaining in hushed tones that Trevor had called an emergency meeting of his own, apparently to formalize my termination before the committee could intervene. Fortunately, board governance supersedes executive authority in personnel matters involving department heads, James said. Elaine was quite insistent we review the situation properly. When we entered the boardroom, Trevor's confident expression faltered visibly. Greg sat beside him, looking uncomfortable as Elaine and 2 other committee members arranged their materials. Clara, Trevor recovered quickly. This is an executive meeting. I don't think... I invited her, James interrupted. Given the serious concerns raised about operational changes, we need her expertise. What concerns? Trevor's voice was sharp. I've simply made a standard personnel change to align with our modernization strategy. Elaine gestured to me. Clara, please share what you've discovered. With calm precision, I presented the documents I'd prepared. I explained how the outsourcing plan contradicted our sustainability commitments. I highlighted the preferential contracts with Trevor's connections, displaying the pricing disparities alongside our standard terms. I showed how the consultant costs, when fully calculated, actually increased expenses rather than creating savings. Most importantly, I concluded, none of these fundamental operational changes were presented to the board for approval, despite governance requirements for strategies impacting our core business model and environmental commitments. Throughout my presentation, Trevor's expression shifted from dismissive to concerned to openly hostile. Greg stared at the table, avoiding eye contact with everyone. When I finished, James turned to Trevor. Is this accurate? Are you implementing these changes without board approval? I was planning to present the complete strategy at the next regular meeting, Trevor claimed. Clara's selectively sharing information out of context because she's disgruntled about being replaced. The documents speak for themselves, I replied, sliding copies of Trevor's own signed directives across the table, including your instruction to begin implementation before the next board meeting. James reviewed the papers, his expression growing increasingly grave. Trevor, I think we need to continue this discussion privately with the committee. Clara, thank you for your thoroughness. Please wait outside. As I left the boardroom, Trevor's glare followed me. Whatever happened next was out of my hands, but I had done what was right for the company I had helped build. 3 hours later, James emerged from the boardroom and asked me to rejoin them. Trevor and Greg were notably absent. The committee has made several decisions, James announced once I was seated. Trevor's employment has been terminated, effective immediately. Greg Wilson will not be assuming the operations manager role. And the outsourcing plan? I asked. Rescinded entirely, Elaine confirmed, as are the preferential contracts that hadn't yet been executed. James cleared his throat. Clara, the committee would like to offer you your position back, with appropriate adjustments to your compensation and authority. We recognize the value you bring to Northwest Timber Products and sincerely regret the disruption caused by Trevor's actions. I considered the offer carefully. Over the past 2 weeks, I had received inquiries from 2 of Northwest's competitors, including one that would mean a significant promotion. I appreciate the offer, I said finally, but I think it's time for me to explore new opportunities. I'd be willing to stay through a proper transition period, however, to stabilize operations and help you find a suitable replacement. James looked disappointed but nodded his understanding. We'll develop appropriate terms for a consulting arrangement during the transition. Would 3 months be sufficient? It was a generous offer that would give me time to properly consider my options. That would be acceptable. As the meeting concluded, Elaine walked me to the elevator. Trevor didn't go quietly, she confided. Threatened legal action, claimed you had violated confidentiality. James informed him that pursuing such claims would trigger a comprehensive audit of his decisions since joining Northwest. I smiled slightly. And Greg? Left immediately after Trevor was escorted out. Apparently, running a car wash didn't prepare him for this level of corporate governance. 2 weeks later, I accepted a position as operations director with a sustainable building materials manufacturer, overseeing their expansion into engineered timber products. Several of my team members eventually joined me there. Northwest Timber Products continues operations with renewed commitment to the sustainable practices I helped establish. I still consult with them occasionally, proof that doing what's right can lead to unexpected new beginnings. Sometimes the most powerful statement isn't what you say when you're shown the door, but what you do after you walk through it.